is Rugby Unity. I am David Pembroke and welcome once again to another of our summertime conversations when we look back on 2025 at what happened during what has been a very big year for the sport, but also think about and look forward to the future. No question in my mind that 2025, the highlight was the Women's Rugby World Cup, an absolutely outstanding event, an outstanding competition, and on every measure, it was an outstanding success. But it was just one part of a year of the game played by women all around the world. And joining me to look back, to reflect and to discuss the state of women's rugby around the world is Libby Nankivell, someone who could be only described as a stalwart of the game of women's rugby and a former Vice President of the Queensland Rugby Union, Libby Nankivell. Libby, welcome to Rugby Unity.
Thanks so much, David. It's great to be here on the Rugby Unity podcast.
So listen, before we jump into a conversation about rugby, women's rugby and where it is and indeed where it's going, perhaps tell us a little bit about your involvement in the sport. Where did it come from and how long have you been involved, and the journey perhaps to Twickenham this year when you were one of 80-odd thousand people there, but you were part of obviously the formal official part of the Women's Rugby World Cup this year.
Oh, thanks, David. Yeah, look, I have always loved rugby. I grew up in Toowoomba in the height of the rugby, I guess, ecosystem at that time. We had Tim Horan playing and Brett Robinson playing and Jason Little playing. So rugby was our life. We spent weekends going to rugby. My dad was a rugby referee. And so we used to, spend a lot of time playing rugby with my brothers. And when I went off to university in Townsville in the early 90s, I sort of went to a rugby club because that's what I knew. I was sort of standing there and I can't remember who said, but I was like, gosh, I wish I could play. And someone said, well, why don't you just create a women's team? And so we did. We created the first Townsville Women's Rugby Union team, which then went on to become the James Cook Uni team. And they still have a great women's comp up there. And I also refereed in Townsville. I got my ticket up there in Townsville as well. And I actually played less rugby than I refereed. I refereed men's and women's games in Toowoomba, in Brisbane, in Sydney, in Townsville. Anywhere I went, I took my boots and I took my whistle and always would turn up at a rugby field and say, hey, do you need a referee? And they would always say yes. So I refereed in some great places. And then sort of after a few decades, I ended up getting married and having kids and wasn't as involved in rugby and thought I'd be more involved when my kids started to play. I've got two sons. And so I managed teams and then ended up in committees and then on boards. I was on the Australian Schools Rugby Union board and also then obviously Vice President for Queensland Rugby. And I just love the game. I'm just passionate about it. I love the strategy of the game. The players come and go for me, but the game remains. Like, I just absolutely love it.
It's a fairly typical path for someone who's contributed to the women's game particularly, isn't it? One of the pioneers of the sport where you and many thousands like you around the world just had to get on with it and just had to make it happen, often with, it would be fair to say, not a whole lot of encouragement.
Yeah, and I think you can see where it did really blossom and there was good support. So we had great support. We had great coaches up in Townsville. I do think about the lack of insurance and registration that we had back in the day, because we used to just ring Charters Towers, ring Ingham, ring Cairns and say, hey, we want to bring a busload or a carload of girls. Do you have any rugby teams who'll play us? And we would just play, and we would have a lot of fun on the way. And so I think we were always very lucky to have great support along the way of male champions who decided they'd coach us or who would help us out. And certainly we had that at the time. Brendan, just had a blank. Brendan helped us a lot in Townsville. It'll come to me in a second. And he was the president at JCU at the time, and he was a really great support for us.
So the women's game, and I mentioned the Women's 2025 Rugby World Cup, which you were attending, and you were involved in a lot of the discussions and the debates, around the particular game. But as someone who's been in the sport for as long as you have, can you take us to that final when you were in Twickenham with 80,000 plus others, many of you who've been supporting the game for many, many years? It must have been a moment.
Oh, look, it was absolutely outstanding. I was fortunate enough to be in England. I was invited to attend the Global Summit on Women's Rugby, which was in that finals week. And that included going to Twickenham with 81,885 of my closest friends to see that England-Canada final and also New Zealand-France game in the bronze. And I just remember staying there. I was with, a bunch of Oceania delegates, from the Cook Islands, from Papua New Guinea, from New Zealand, with some of the Australians, and just in awe, the vibe, the sound, the noise, the crowd. It was just absolutely incredible. And I think what was incredible about it was the type of people in the crowd. So lots of families, lots of young teenage boys. Like we always say, there's lots of girls. Gosh, there are a lot of boys and a lot of men in that as well. And I think it's just such a different product, women's rugby, in that World Cup. That's what it really showed me, even at the semi-final, that, people attend it in a different way. The game times are really game-friendly, family-friendly. The offerings, the food available, the price of the tickets, because it's a real family occasion. So we saw lots of groups of teenage girls and boys in attendance, really young girls with their parents, with their dads, lots of father-daughter moments, of course, because lots of dads love rugby already. But it's really, I could see it was a really different crowd, compared to going to the Lions here. It's a very atypical crowd, predominantly male, probably a decade or more older than me, lots of grey hair around. It's a really different socioeconomic demographic. And I think that's what's different about women's sport as well, as a whole. We saw that with the Matildas as well. But the World Cup, I think World Rugby, real credit to them. They were very visionary. They really thought big. They designed a model for that tournament across England, which was very different from what we did in New Zealand for the World Cup. And Australia will have to do the same. We'll have to think differently.
So what were some of the things that were different from New Zealand to England this time?
So I think what they decided to do in England was they didn't use traditional rugby fields and rugby stadiums. They picked stadiums that were bigger for some of those games, like Brighton, etc., and so that they could go to some of the areas that weren't typically rugby fans, and they really made it very accessible. A lot of hype. The social media, I think, that they did during the World Cup was outstanding. World Rugby really encouraged all of the players to post, teams to post. They reposted things that teams and individuals would post, which you don't often see from a competition organiser, posting what an individual would post. They also put some really great software in place for the players so that they could be protected. And when they did get targeted, World Rugby had a specific social media strategy, and they talked about this at the Global Summit, where instead of talking about the people that are abusing the players, they highlighted the players and put out show reels of the players being absolutely amazing. So Georgie from Wales, who has a bow in her hair, got a bit criticised because she's got a bow in her hair, and Welsh rugby and UK, keyboard warriors were saying some pretty nasty things about her. And they just put out some fantastic social media. And then the other thing to really kind of combat that, but the other thing at the actual games, like in Bristol at the semi-finals, they just had different entertainment. It was lots of cultural entertainment, lots of really fun, very family orientated, like drummers, people on stilts, like really entertaining, and entertaining for kids, which I think is, a really big part of their market. And they really wanted people, I think some stat like 70% of people of the 500,000 people who bought tickets to the World Cup in England had not ever been to a rugby game before. So now it's up to those clubs to convert that, right? So that they come back to see those players.
Yeah, I think the other part of that particular statistic was not only was it 70% for the first time, but 90% of the people said they intended to come again, which is obviously part of the appeal. But what do you put this down to, that there is this difference between the fan base of the women's game and the fan base of the men's game? And it's not to say that it's unique, because I do know and I've mentioned this a few times on Rugby Unity before, that in the Women's National Basketball League or the WNBA in America, they've found exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. That there is a crossover, there is a Venn diagram crossover, but it's very small between the men's and the women's game. And they are considered and acted upon as two different supporter bases.
Yeah, so I think there's two main reasons. One, I think, is it's where the players come from. So the players don't come from a traditional, GPS school modelling, the academies, et cetera, et cetera. They come from everywhere. Desi Miller came out of gymnastics. Sophie DeGood came out of basketball, hockey, a million other sports. So people come from other sports. And I think sometimes when they've come from other sports, and obviously a lot come from touch in the past, but really you want people who play any sport, particularly for females, because not all females want to play contact sport. I loved it. I didn't get an opportunity to do it until I was in my early 20s and had left school. But I see the value of playing contact sport was so much fun, whereas young boys grow up with contact sport. So giving them the opportunity to play contact sport. But I think when they come from other sports, they don't have the same socioeconomic backgrounds, and they come from different suburbs, and they come from all over the city or all over the state. And that's what I think is really different. The other thing I think that's different is we've now got generations of young or dads who now can introduce their daughters into the sport that they also loved. So, my dad loved rugby, and we would go to rugby because he's refereeing, and my mum got rid of us for a few hours. I think that was pretty nice for her on a Saturday morning. But I think now, like lots of families, you go to any club rugby and there's lots of community, lots of families. But now it's not just standing around watching dad play or your brothers play. Your sisters and your mum can be playing as well. And I think that's the difference, is you introducing like all of those players and that family, and then their extended family come as the fans. So I think they're the two main differences.
Interesting. You mentioned that. I attended the competition here in and around where I live here in Canberra. It's just it's not in the Canberra competition. It's the adjacent sort of southwestern competition. And the men were playing. It was Burrawa playing Harden in the men's grand final, but they had the women's grand final before, which was between Temora and West Wyalong. Now, those names aren't going to mean a lot to people overseas, but these are country towns playing against each other. But they had the women's and the men's on the same day, one before the other. The place was absolutely packed. You could not have fitted another person in there. It was a great rugby occasion. But what I noticed was it was a very different rugby occasion. And I wonder if you think that might be the future of the way that the game develops, is that it does develop together as opposed to developing apart?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think so. At community rugby, I think developing together makes a lot of sense, and you see it like when you go to country rugby anywhere in the world, any club, and they've got both teams playing. It's always, the men stay around and watch the women, or the women stay around and watch the men, whatever it is, and people are often there to watch more than one game, because when people feel welcomed, respected, and accepted in a club environment, then they continue to go back. And we have great communities in rugby. Like rugby clubs are just so much fun. And I think what's interesting at the top level though is it's sport entertainment. And that's what we saw in England at the World Cup. And I actually think last year here in Queensland, in Australia, the Queensland Reds women played all their home games at Ballymore and didn't play them as a tack on at Suncorp, which is where our Queensland Reds men play. They played them separately. And I think having them separate is actually better, and it develops those fans in a different way. So there aren't many fans who, there is that crossover, and it's a small, like as you said, it's small in that, it's a small crossover. But if you have it at a club environment and build and build and build, which is what they've done in England over the last few years, ready for that World Cup, then that sport entertainment, and we can see the quality of the rugby is so good now. The women are just playing, they're incredible athletes. We saw it on the big stage. And I think having it separate, I would actually vote to have it separate.
Okay. That quality piece that you mentioned there around the way that the women played the game at the 2025 Rugby World Cup, I think anybody who enjoys the game of rugby would have enjoyed watching the way that the women played, because it's different, because it's women playing rugby, it's not men playing rugby, and so it is different. It's played differently for those reasons. But the quality was outstanding, wasn't it? The ball movement, some of the strategic thinking, some of the patterns that were played. There was just it was a big step forward from what we'd seen at the last World Cup, and it was very encouraging, I would have thought, for supporters of women's rugby around the world to see that the game has now reached this level. And clearly, the English team were the outstanding team of the competition, but you could see that the benefit that they've had from years and years of significant investment in their particular program. But perhaps your thoughts about how does the rest of the world catch England? Because not only have they performed well up until this point, and, big congratulations to them for winning the tournament, but the thing I liked about, the post-tournament was that they very quickly said, okay, and here's our plan going to 2030. And here are our specific, measurable, accountable, realistic and time-bound objectives about how much revenue they're going to raise and how many participants they're going to have. So they're really continuing to push the envelope. So how does everybody chase England now?
Yeah, look, they're very visionary and very strategic in their thinking. And I think, they missed out on that in the World Cup in New Zealand. Obviously, the Black Ferns won, and then they were at that final, and they wanted to be at the final, and they wanted to win it in a home World Cup, like any team that hosts, right? So the Wallabies and the Wallaroos would be thinking the same. We're hosting World Cups. Not only do you want to be, in the final, you want to be winning it and raising the cup, right? That's like the absolute ultimate for any home nation. We saw it in South Africa when they won. We saw the disappointment in France in the men when they lost, right, and didn't raise that cup. So I think one of the things I think is really interesting is that the type of rugby we saw, and it was really entertaining rugby. And I think that that's because England had a game that was very, strong in the forwards, and they had incredible players, in their backs. but the other top 4 teams all have integrated 7s, 15s competitions. So I think Canada is a really interesting example. Like Canada were number 2 going into the tournament. They'd been number 2 in the world for a while. Anyone who was watching women's rugby, we knew they were going to be up there. It was really between, the Black Ferns, Canada and England were the top. Who would be the 4th team was really the question for me going into the tournament. Canada is really interesting. So, something like 10 of their 23 players are full-time on that 7 circuit. The rest of the players, they all outsource all of their high performance and they play in the league, the power league in England and in France. So they don't have a high performance program. They don't have they do have a high performance program, but they don't have a strong domestic high performance program. They don't have a strong domestic competition, and yet they're number 2 in the world. So it's not just about investment in terms of money. It's about investing in the players and ensuring that they get quality club competition games, or so that they can bring those experiences from all those different coaches and all that different experience back into that national team and then play together as a unit. That team has played together as a unit for a long time as well, at least 2-3 years, I think maybe 3 years, that squad, maybe with a few exceptions. So they also had a lot of consistency, but their players are spread across the world during the usual season. And I think there was a stat at the Global Summit about, I think, the top 8 teams and how many of the top 8 teams had integrated 7s and 15s players into their squads at the World Cup. And it was pretty high. There were a lot of them. So I think for women's rugby, that is very successful and it works well because we don't have long domestic competitions. We don't have the same kind of, strength that exists for them to have quality club games. So even at the moment, there's a number of players, in straight after that World Cup, in the national level from the Black Ferns, from Canada, some of the, Queensland Reds girls are playing in domestic, that power league in the Trailblazers, etc. So Trailfinders, in the power league. So getting them that experience is absolute gold. And basically it saves us money in the long run.
So do you think that's a model that can be sustained over time to continue to develop the women's game, that there be these elite leagues like the Power League and that's where the development of the game should take place at that domestic level, and therefore investment in Super Rugby competition, for example, which we've seen the announcements that, there was the big hope that there was going to be the opportunity to play each other twice, the domestic teams in Australia, but that's now not going to happen. So are you saying that is probably a reasonable choice and that the investment should be carried by the Power League to continue to grow the women's game?
Well, I think it's an option. It is really disappointing that we haven't expanded the Super W program. And I think, that was mooted, that there'd be a home and away competition, that they would play each other twice. Really, that's what we have to move to. There was also last year, and I think again this year, the Penina Pacifica team, which is predominantly the Tongans and Samoan women who don't have domestic competitions in their own countries, were in a combined team and played in a pre-season competition and played the Super W teams. There was hope, I think, for them or even Moana to have a women's team into that Super W, and that hasn't come through. And I think, we have to look at things differently. And, comparing the England and the Canada model, they are 2 totally different models of development, and yet both have resulted in great success. So I think you have to look at what works best for your, nation and your country and the finances and what you can actually deliver on. And I think the other thing we have here in Australia, obviously we have Rugby League and we have a great NRLW competition, which is similar to Rugby Union but different if you're international. And so we have women who play in that league. I mean, ideally in my perfect world, if I was, had had a magic wand, I would let the players play NRLW and play rugby union because, again, only so many women want to play a contact sport. Let them play both, and wouldn't we both benefit? NRLW is, wrapping up contracts for 3 years for players and not releasing them for rugby union games. So that's not great for us, but we can see a lot of our rugby union players do go to NRLW because of the longer length of the domestic competition. And, they learn so many amazing skills, experiences that they can then bring back to rugby union. So having complementary seasons, I think would be a real benefit to all of us, to both all those different franchises, and then obviously for the national team as well, on both sides.
But the rugby league in Australia aren't going to play nice, are they? That's not sort of the way that they go about things. It's
No,
they want to be the number one. They want to
Yep.
they want to stand alone. They want to be they want to all the elite women's rugby players or rugby league players to play in their competition. So they're not really going to help rugby out, are they?
Well, I understand there has been conversations between RA and Rugby Australia and National Rugby League, but there are not. It's one that Rugby Australia would be keen to do, but NRL, you're correct, have said they're not interested with the current CEO.
Were you disappointed with that lack? You mentioned that you were disappointed about that, the lack of the second round. Do you think Rugby Australia's missed an opportunity there, particularly given that the Australia will host the 2029 Women's Rugby World Cup here in Australia?
Yeah, look, I think, I am disappointed. I understand, it comes down to money. It's always down to money, and, investing in the women's sport is needed, and, specific investment for the women's team is really absolutely essential. And I think, look, we are 4 years out from a World Cup. We have a really great opportunity to showcase the Wallaroos. Look how successful our Rugby Sevens women's team is. And we know a lot of those players are also, great in the Rugby 15s competition as well. And we could really absolutely shine. I mean, Jo Yap, before she left, the Wallaroos coach, who finished after the World Cup, did say this team, they could win that World Cup in 2029 with support and investment. And I agree with that statement. I think that's true. I think also with hosting the 27 Men's World Cup, there's also a great opportunity to do some integration and extra, I guess, showcasing of the women's teams. When we had the Lions touring here, the men's Lions, the women's Wales team was touring at the same time. So there is a great opportunity to do something when the World Cup's on for the women and showcase them in that time with those fans.
So are you suggesting that the women's sevens players who, well, let's talk about Australia at the moment, because they are, one of the elite teams in the world there, and there has been significant investment over many, many years. Would you expect that they will be encouraged to play 15s now, and that there will be less emphasis on sevens, more emphasis on the 15s game as we head to 2029?
I think that looking at, if we don't have that strong domestic competition and expand it to home and away, at least to home and away games, then, or additional teams, whatever way that looks, that you have to look at your sevens players. I mean, they're full-time professional athletes. We had some of them come into the Queensland Reds team this year, and just the difference, because they're full-time professional compared to the semi-professional and part-time players, that just the level of commitment that they can give, their dedication, their focus, like they're thinking about it 100% of the time. Not, I've got to go and lay some concrete this afternoon, or I've got to go back to my NJS carer job, or I've got to go back to, disability carer job, or I've got to go back to my teaching job, whatever it is. They were absolutely dedicated. And I think having that focus and using and utilising those players the ones who can and want to transfer. They can't all transfer, but you need to look at who can and do both. I think the investment in the sevens is fantastic, particularly the results we see in the women's is outstanding. And, you know, that's a lot to do with, I think, the consistency they've had in those players and in that coaching for a long time.
Where do you see the seven-a-side sort of program moving, given that we've seen the major changes that have taken place this year? We've seen this new competition, which is underway at the moment in this new format. Sevens is clearly the sport of the Olympics, and who will ever forget the seven-a-side tournament in Paris? It reached the threshold of unforgettable, I think, when you had both men's and women's teams playing over those 2 days, 6 sessions, all sold out, stunning, you know, played before the opening ceremony. Like it was a moment for rugby. But where do you see it going? Because clearly, and we speak about it a lot on the Rugby Unity podcast, about how do we secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world, particularly at a time when the game is challenged financially. Because I'm sure Australian rugby would love to have been able to fund 2 rounds of the Super W competition, but clearly they didn't feel that they had enough money there to be able to fund that. And there are just so many mouths to feed for each of the national unions. You know, it's a very complex, difficult, challenging job. But just back to it, around sevens, where do you see it growing? Where do you see it evolving to? And how does it fit into, you know, the long-term future sustainability of the game?
Oh, look, I love the sevens format because it is that sport entertainment. Like you're there for, you know, a day or half a day. You get to watch lots of players. You know, any time we have the Vegas Sevens here in Brisbane, which I love, down at West Rugby Club. And it's just full of fun. It has some of the professional teams and then some of the fun teams. It is a really great format. I think from a community perspective, there are stalwarts who love the 15s and there are, you know, the people who love the sevens. The sevens, we're seeing a real growth in the schools, particularly in the girls' schools. They seem more adaptable to, I guess, you know, including sevens rugby in their sports programs. And I think that is because it has the Olympics attached to it. So then from a broader perspective and from a Rugby Australia perspective, you know, there is that funding that comes with Olympics, right? So that makes a big difference at all our, you know, state sporting academies, etc., because you actually can fund a program and fund academies and then therefore fund competitions. So it is really important to have that growth in the sevens area, particularly when Brisbane's going to host the 2032 Olympics. So yes, we've got 2 years, you know, 4 years of focus on 15s and then quick focus on the sevens in the next round, particularly here in Queensland. So I think, yeah, it is an interesting one. It seems to be, I do get a lot of people who comment that they're happy for their girls to play, you know, touch. They're happy for them to play rugby sevens, but they're not quite there on the 15s. And I think that's because they just haven't been brought up around it. When you've seen it, when you've been in the scrum, when you've been at the bottom of them all, you know it's okay. You know, or the bottom of ruck, sorry, you know it's okay, and that's just tackling, that's just contact sport, and that's okay. But it is, you know, really socializing it, I guess. And when you see incredible athletes like Maddie and Teagan, Levi and Charlotte Caslick and Faith Nathan and all those sevens players, they are incredible athletes and they're great role models because they're super strong and fit and really smart girls. And it's really great to see, you know, that those young women are out there playing that kind of sport and playing rugby.
So it's, yeah, and look, who wants to be a sports administrator? You know, like it's a hard job, you know, like you sit there and there's no one who's not deserving of a greater, you know, investment, whether it be pathways or the men's game, the women's game, sevens game, whatever it might be. So, my heart goes out to every rugby administrator, and I know why I am not one, because I just think it's a tough job. But there are some, again, working off the 2025 World Cup as we move to the future of the women's game, the World XV tournament that's now been announced and ready to go for next year, and clearly it's an enhanced international competition next year for the women's game, where we're these great personalities and heroes that we've got to know in 2025, where we're going to see them again in 2026 in the World XV. So perhaps give us your thoughts about World XV and what it potentially can do to grow the women's game, because one of the big challenges is around this funding. And at the moment, while the England team are able to attract some level of commercial support, most every other women's team at the moment just doesn't have that support, which enables the game to grow and to grow faster.
Yeah, I think, look, the WXV competition has been the best thing that's happened certainly for Rugby Australia and the Wallaroos, because it really, for a long time, we were all hoping, domestic competition and then the Super W competition and the growth of the Super W would feed into the Wallaroos, and that would make everyone better and we'd have a better team. And, we were sort of bottom up, the groundswell of community women's rugby, and then up. But I think what it did was when WXV got introduced, it really forced Rugby Australia top down. So all of a sudden, instead of 4 tests that they might have had, we had 10. And so if you've suddenly got 10 tests for your national team, well, we had to appoint a full-time coach, right? Which was when we got Joe Yap as the first full-time coach for the Wallaroos. And I think that really was great and we saw for all of the nations who were in WXV 1 and 2 and 3, because you were sort of forced to improve your national teams. And that was sort of to push all of us so that the successful 2025 Women's World Cup we just had was as entertaining as it was. I mean, look at that incredible South African women's team. They were just an absolute star at the tournament. And, we loved seeing, the Fijiana girls, and, it was just so fantastic seeing all the different teams and seeing the difference even from, the New Zealand World Cup 4 years earlier was absolutely astonishing. And I think that's a credit to World Rugby, because they put that WXV competition in, and it's forced it top down. So I think this year, what year are we? 25, it's December.
2025.
26 is going to be great, because there's 10 tests for the Wallaroos. So again, it means you've got to look at, that competition. They're playing some really tough games though. So they'll be playing, they're playing New Zealand, who were, in that bronze final. They're playing Canada, who were in the finals. They'll be playing Scotland. We're going to play the Wallaroos 100th test. That's pretty exciting, and I think that's what's forced us to do that.
We're not talking rugby, we're building it. Rugby Unity.
Yeah. But I also think that, for me anyway, the opportunity again to see, Braxton Sorensen McGee, Georgia Miller from the Black Ferns, I got to follow them and I admired them. But now I'm going to be able to see them again. I'm going to see them regularly, which I think is, the competitions. And we know from World Rugby that competitions drive interest and, that they drive attention. And I think the potential of the women's game is obvious. We saw at the the Women's Rugby World Cup this year, but we also saw the emergence of such, powerhouse personalities like Ellie Kildunne,
Yes.
The England fullback, who is this, jack in the box, mop head, fun. But she's now had such an impact in the UK. She's now going to compete, or she's been nominated as the BBC Sports Personality of the Year, or one of the nominees for. Now, that is a significant accomplishment. That is a huge achievement for the women's game and for Ellie. to be recognised amongst all of the other, incredible sports people that there are in the UK. That must have been another moment for you as well, when you saw Ellie nominated for that award.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not like women's sports personality of the year. It's player of the year. It's absolutely fantastic. I mean, and who doesn't want to see Meg Jones again and Hannah Botterman, and like that Red Roses team has some real characters in it, who are just fantastic athletes, fantastic players, big personalities off and on the field. And I think that's what really helps you connect with the players. There's so many good stories to tell. And I think that's what, World Rugby and the teams were encouraged and the players were encouraged during that tournament to tell their stories, the good, the bad and the ugly, right? And I think that was really powerful for all of us. And even, Fijiana had a really tough start playing Canada, and everyone was, really hard on them as a young team. And yet Canada's number 2 in the world, of course they're not going to do so well playing them. No, Canada, England. Who did they play? I've had a blank.
Clearly, as you say, World Rugby went in with a plan, a very clear plan around the promotion of the sport, around the World Cup. Was it, personality focused, loads of content, there's as much content as you possibly could, everyone being given as much encouragement as they possibly could. And it worked. They had over 1 billion impressions throughout the tournament. And certainly for me, set a mark for the sport and an example to the men's game about how they can grow the game, because, we have this remarkable sport that is played in 134 countries around the world, if not more. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people play the sport. 500 million people nominated by Nielsen saying that they're fans of the sport, but we still struggle with this financial sustainability. So the game's not joined up, and we're perhaps not promoting ourselves as well as we need to. But I do think that the women belled the cat, really, and showed us that, here is the way. And subsequently, we've seen, activity from people like Henry Pollock and some of his mates in the England team, really getting after it a little bit more about, being a bit more themselves and having a bit more fun. How do we grow that? How do you think that we can best do that, knowing that it works, knowing that the formula is there as to what we need to do to attract more attention in the attention economy when everybody else is competing for time and attention?
Look, I think there's it is up to individuals, and all we can do is support them. As you and I know, in this digital world, that being authentic is the best thing you can be. We've seen that, Alona Ma's the great example of that, right? And but it's also, you got to have some pretty thick skin too. So because people are quite cruel and people can be very direct, and that's always I guess putting yourself out there as an individual or a player. So what World Rugby did was support the ones who wanted to do that. And so some of them had, every team had a dedicated social media person funded by World Rugby, so that they could catch all that content and all that dance, crazes that go on, and all the TikTok and all that fun, and it's like just human. Like, yes, they're incredible athletes on the field. And then you see the difference, off the field. And so you can see that they can be, different people on and off the field, or sometimes they're exactly the same on and off, right? And I think that was a really clever strategy to embed one in with every team, so that nobody went without and everybody could create content from their accounts. And so that, just kept generating. And I think the teams were also watching what each other's teams, or the social media people in the teams were watching what other teams were doing. And then, that was kind of snowballing. And so it just kept snowballing. And I think we just have to support them. I think I did hear the social media software that they have to prevent trolls and prevent some of the language coming through direct to players is quite good. And it also goes to the players and their families and the referees and their families. So I heard incidentally from Jess Ling, who was over there as an assistant referee on the sidelines, that Holly Davidson had said to her mum gets messages on social media that are pretty horrible every time Holly referees. So her mum now has the software, right? So we're looking after people and looking after the rugby family, and that's what we should be doing. So I think it's sort of twofold. We've got to promote it and do it the best way we can, but we also have to make sure we look after them.
How do we encourage it, though, just not inside these big tentpole moments like, Rugby World Cup 2025? How do we sustain it, 365 days a year, every year, or how do we grow it over that period? Clearly, you're not going to, you have those intense periods of engagement, but, when I just, and again, this podcast has been put in place with one very, very simple mission, and it's how do we help secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world? That's all that's it. That's the beginning, the middle, and the end, and that comes back to often money. How do we generate more money in the sport? Because even recently we've seen the Scottish, the Irish, the English rugby unions all reporting their financial results for another year, and guess what? They're all in the red again. Now, better than they were the year before, but still, there's more work to be done. And again, we look at Australian rugby, they're unable to fund that second lot of, that second round of the Super W, which would have been, immensely beneficial, not only to the Australian teams, but to our Pacifica teams as well, who would have participated in the competition. So do you have thoughts about how we can help secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world, given that we have this incredible sport, amazingly diverse, that it starts from children all the way up to veterans. It's men's, it's women's, it's 15s, it's 7s, it's 134 countries around the world. It has so many, a values-based game where everybody who is involved in the game is united by, a central set of values that drives the behaviour in the sport. Like, if you're the NBA, if you're the NFL, if you're the MLB, if you're the National Hockey League in North America, they all want to get out of North America and get to the world. Now, we're in the world, but we just don't seem at the moment to have it joined up well enough, aligned well enough that we're able to solve enough business problems of these major corporations such that they will give us more money to grow our game. So that's a bit of a rave and a bit of a rant, but what are your thoughts? I've got my thoughts, and I give people those thoughts quite regularly, but what are your thoughts?
I think it is interesting. So at the Global Summit on Women's Rugby, we sort of had 400 delegates, right? So we had people from Rwanda, from the Cook Islands, from Egypt, from the Ukraine. So people running men and women, running women's programs all over the world, some with everything and some with not very much, but they still just get on and do it. I think you just get on and do it is part of it. Some of the countries you've mentioned, do also have private club and franchise ownership, which we don't have in Australia. And I think there's good and bad to that. There's pros and cons to that in terms of being able to release players for national teams and people, you're at the whim of a single owner of a club and those kind of things. But I think that is an interesting model. It doesn't feel like it would work here because we don't have that for any of our sporting codes. But, it's quite common in France and also in the US in various sports and in England. And I think that's an interesting model, but I feel like that wouldn't really work here. I think you just have to have a great product. When you have winning teams, and it's always, is it top down or bottom up, of how you support the teams? Is it the pathways or is it the players and the coaching? I mean, at the moment, For the Wallaroos, they just had a camp. They've got an interim coach. You know, where was the succession planning for the coach? Jo Yap announced that she was leaving the World Cup after the World Cup. Like, lots of movement happens after every World Cup in men's and women's. You know, we had this massive succession plan for Joe Schmidt when he left and is, you know, announced his leaving from the Wallabies, but we haven't had the same thinking, the same strategic decision making by the board, by the CEO, by those inside, you know, around what happens with that. And I think, you know, is that tied to money, or is that tied to how they think about the game and not seeing what happened at the World Cup in England to go, no, this is an absolute necessity. We've got to have a great plan. And I think, you know, one of the things I often say about rugby in Australia is that, you know, probably 20, 30 years ago, Rugby Australia made a decision, or ARU back in the day, not to take gambling money. So the big franchises here, you know, in the other two big codes in Australia, all have, you know, big clubs with poker machines and have gambling sponsorship. And Rugby Australia chose not to take that money. And from a moral perspective, I think that that's really important. I have, you know, friends who have been very affected by that. And then, but from a money perspective, you think, damn, what an opportunity missed, right? And then obviously the broadcasting rights are the other really big one. So when you've got a great product, people want to buy your broadcasting. So it's got to be sport entertainment. It's got to be entertaining. It's got to be easy for people to understand or explain what's going on. And I think there's been some good changes, you know, in the laws as we go through from World Rugby, and then it's, you know, laws of the game, rules of the tournament. You can choose. How many tournaments have you been at, David, where they go, right, there's no kicking in this tournament. We just get on with it, right? Or whatever rules they decide, you can decide, as long as there's agreement, you can make it as entertaining as you like.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And I take your point there about that appointment of the interim coach. I do think that Rugby Australia missed a trick in not having an England-like plan ready for 2029. I think that was the opportunity to really come out with something decisive, something clear, something accountable that would give everybody clarity about what the next 4 years looks like in detail, and invest in it. Because you're going to have to, there is going to have to be significant investment made in the game. And I do think post 2025, that was the opportunity for that. So listen, just a couple of things before we go. If I might just take you back to that global summit, what were some of the other conversations that struck you there that are worth sharing with people listening today who have got an interest in the game and have got an interest in helping to secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world?
Oh, look, I think there was a great session from MasterCard, who were doing the sponsorship, you know, of rugby. They're big supporters of rugby across both men and women's. And they had done a pop-up shop in Bond Street in London called Style of Our Own, which featured only women's owned sports apparel. And so they had all the Women's Rugby World Cup apparel, and then every other, you know, women's brand from around the world. They opened for about 6 months, and then it closed sort of after the World Cup tournament. And they talked about having that pop-up and the response they got. You know, Whoopi Goldberg turned up, printed her own T-shirt, wore it that night when she was performing. You know, Billie Jean came and King came, and they had a little tennis, because they had a little court there where you could play football, rugby, tennis, all sorts of things, a little indoor kind of space, like the size of half a basketball court kind of thing, which was turf. So that was a really clever way to, again, get engaged. So they had lots of influencers and all that kind of thing. So get engagement around in the build up to the World Cup around just sport in general and women's sport. And this is the other thing they did in activations, like at Bristol at the semi-final in the fan zone, they had all sports. So you could try ice hockey, you could try netball, you could try, like Bristol Council just wants people and women and girls to be active in sport and to just be active in any sport. So rugby actually embraced all sports in both of those examples. And the other really interesting one at the Global Summit, was the we had the owner of Angel City Football Club out of the US, which is a women's only owned and a women's only team. There's not a men's team, and they built a stadium and they play in a tournament, and just how they funded it. So one is from an ex-person who's in the financial sector, and then we had another, it was football as well, or soccer, as some people call it, team who were community funded. I can't think of that team, but they just talked about the different modelling and the different options of how to do something and how to create a team in your neighbourhood or in your community. So that was quite interesting. And then we had just great people from all over the world. You know, in Ukraine, in the middle of a war zone, there's a woman still running women's rugby programs. And you sort of think, why on earth would you do that? But she's like, you know, it means for 80 minutes a week, we're not thinking about what's going on in our lives. We're staying connected. We're supporting each other. This is the rugby family, right? And they're doing it in the middle of a war zone. And you really admire that. In Laos, there's fantastic rugby going on in Laos and growth in Laos with young girls supported by UN Women and Children. And they use, you know, sport diplomacy and sport as a soft channel around, you know, talking about some of those difficult topics, particularly around violence against women and children, and empowering young girls about themselves, their own strength, their bodies, you know, to be strong. And I think that's fantastic. So there were lots and lots of insights. I could talk all day about that.
Yeah. So just, you'd have to be happy then. Like, so I'm just sort of trying to take the temperature of, you know, the young girl who grew up in Toowoomba, went to James Cook, started the rugby club up there, picked up the referee's whistle, got your ticket. You know, you've been through it over years and years and years, and you've seen it from every angle. You know, you've served as a vice president on the Queensland Rugby Union, which looks after, you know, both men's and women's games. But as we come to the end of 2025, how do you sum it all up? Because for me, I like, you know, and I've been raving about it all year since it happened, this Women's Rugby World Cup. It absolutely took my breath away, and I've now got so many great teams that I want to follow. You know, and I want to just see what is that South African team going to do, because I think they're going to be a handful. Yeah. You know, the French, we could see the French coming, and it's like, what are they going to do? You know, how are the English team going to keep getting the Black Ferns? Don't worry about them. They'll be working day and night to come back. Where is Australia going to be? What about the Welsh? The Scottish played some great rugby. You know, the Spanish. There's just so much to look at and so much to enjoy. And I'd have to say I'm new to it all. But as someone who is of the game, of the women's game, you know, how do you sum up where we're at the end of 2025?
Oh, I do love the slogan from the Women's World Cup about this energy never stops. You know, I think that I'm so proud. I'm just so proud and so stoked that, you know, that the game has progressed. It's, you know, I keep meeting people who are my era, who are, get called trailblazers. We just did it for a bit of fun. We just get involved because we love the game. Like everyone, you don't do it for the end. You know, I'm never represented at a national or a state level. You know, I'm a really strong community person. I love the rugby family, and I'm just so proud. Every time I see the Wallaroos run on, I'm so excited for them, and I'm so proud of them. You know, watching the Canada-New Zealand semi-final, I was actually wearing a Canada rugby jersey because my best friend is a Canadian-Australian. I said I'd wear it for her. But I was there crying at the end because I was so happy for Canada that they got through, but so sad for the Black Ferns because I love the Black Ferns as well. I just love so many of the teams. And I'm just so proud of everyone. I think, you know, we don't give up. You do it with not much and you just keep going. And yes, there's lots of, you know, roadblocks in the way, and you just get on with it and just keep going. And so I think I have great faith after being at that World Cup that we can do it, that it will be a successful World Cup. There will be great crowds. Look what happened when the Matildas were here. You know, they got 77,000 to the final. The Matildas weren't even there. Didn't matter. We had this great final. Everyone got, I went to a football game. I've never been to a soccer game in my life, but I went along. I saw the Irish girls play. It was absolutely fantastic. And you just want to be involved and want to support it because it's entertaining, it's fun, it's competitive, and there's surprises. Like all tournaments, there's surprises along the way. And I think that's what makes a great tournament too.
Well, you know, when you think about the improvements from 22, Women's Rugby World Cup, across the board, yes, the elite level at 22 was pretty good rugby or really good rugby, but to have then seen it get to 25, who knows where it's going to be by 2029 in terms of a game to observe. I think it will be stunning, and we'll get to enjoy it again along the way, World XV. And as you say, there are, you know, thousands, tens of thousands of young girls around the world who have been inspired by those matches, and they're now, you know, joining their clubs, playing the game, and the growth will continue. And I'm sure that Australia will rise to the challenge of, hosting a Rugby World Cup that is better than the 2025. You know, that's the challenge, isn't it? Is to take the mantle and to build and to grow. So there's lots to look forward to there, but certainly the World XV next year, I think, gives us a real focus. And again, it's like the Nations Championship, I think, in the men's. That's going to give us a real focus again to grow the men's game as well. Another competition. And again, this is all part of the strategy out of World Rugby. So congratulations for them for those investments that they've made in those competitions. So certainly a lot to look forward to. We say goodbye to 2025, but we say hello to what will be a very big and bright 2026 for the game of rugby union. And here at Rugby Unity, we'll be continuing many conversations about how is it that we can help secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world. And Libby Nankivell, thank you very much for joining us for your look back and look forward around the year. And we look forward to having further conversations with you in 2026. So a big thanks to Libby Nankivell for joining us today for a discussion about the wonderful game of rugby played as it is so beautifully by women around the world in both the sevens and in the 15s. And listen, seriously, that 2025 Women's Rugby World Cup and that final, you know, to see Twickenham just ablaze with, you know, the white jerseys and just an amazing occasion for the sport. So again, congratulations to everybody who contributed to that amazing success. And so a big thanks to you for coming back once again. And I do hope you enjoyed my conversation with Libby Nankivell today. Now, as always, a rating, a review, a subscription, a comment, wherever you might connect with us on our platform, be it on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, on social media, please let us know your thoughts. And we do have a survey that is on the link. So click onto that and let us know what you think about Rugby Unity, but also what are the things that you want to talk about and how indeed are you going to contribute to the future prosperity of rugby union around the world? Because as I often say, World Rugby can do what World Rugby can do. National unions can do what national unions can do. Professional teams can do what professional teams can do. But ultimately, the future prosperity of the game will come down to the actions of individuals. So what are you going to do? What are you thinking? Why don't you think, as you think over and have a bit of a rest over Christmas, what are you going to do next year to get involved? How are you going to join your team? Go and cook a sausage, run a line, pick up a whistle with Libby Nankivell and get involved. But ultimately, the future prosperity of the game will come from the efforts of the individual. So let's not forget that as we continue to ask and expect from others. Just exactly reflect on yourself, what you might do and how this wonderful values-based global game that is played all around the world, you know, what gift it can give you, the joy that it can give you, but also what you can give to this great game. So Anyway, homily over for today. But listen, thanks again for coming back. Very much appreciate that. And we'll continue this series of conversations through the holiday period as we build up towards the 2026 season. But for the moment, people, please be kind to each other. My name is David Pembroke, and it's bye for now.